Hello and welcome to Language of the Soul podcast. I'm your host, Dominick Domingo.
And I'm your co-host, Virginia Grenier.
We'd like to invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy some inspiring conversation. Here at Language of the Soul, we know that life is story. Individually, we're the products of the stories we tell about ourselves. Culture is the amalgamation of the stories we weave about the human condition. Here's the thing. Individually and collectively, we can write our own story. Thanks for tuning in and joining in the march toward human potential. Hello and welcome to Language of the Soul podcast, where life is story. Thanks so much for joining us today. Virginia and I are both very excited about our guest, as is often the case, but today it's a little bit ironic because in the last couple episodes, the very topic of today's guest's book has been coming up. So it's very germane and relevant to, what's on our radar at the moment. And I will read his bio in its entirety, but for starters, he's a neuroscience researcher, but currently identifies as an educator and has written a book about narcissism. So I am going to do a slightly longer introduction than I normally would because I'd very much like to read the Amazon coverage of the book, just to lay the groundwork for our conversation. So buckle up and everybody hang in there, slightly longer intro than normal. After completing his PhD in neuroscience, Stuart Wood worked for 20 years in clinical research and medical education, where he became renowned for his strong people skills and ability to clearly explain complex ideas to people of all ages and abilities. And we joked in the pre-interview, we're going to talk neuroscience for dummies and narcissism for dummies. I, along with, I'm sure some of our listeners could use a little clarification of some of these pop psychology terms that have been very much floating around in social media. So I'm glad that he can explain complex ideas to people of all ages and abilities, including very ignorant people like me. Since 2008, Stuart has helped thousands of people to challenge and conquer their fears using a wide range of legged and non-legged creatures. I'm going to be asking about that. That's open to interpretation. Okay, Stuart supported a friend out of an abusive narcissistic marriage, which enabled them to begin rebuilding their life. Out of these experiences, he wrote, Escaping the Void, How to Support Victims Out of Emotionally Abusive Relationships. And that's the book we're going to hopefully talk about quite a bit. Stuart focuses on context and the bigger picture. He also hangs around with musicians, is an experienced drummer and percussionist, and a keen photographer. Normally, I would say, welcome, Stuart Wood. But before I bring you into the room, Stuart, I am going to read the blurb for your book, because I don't want to miss that or skip over it. Escaping the Void, How to Support Victims Out of Emotionally Abusive Relationships. Escaping the Void opens our eyes to narcissists, how they infiltrate and infect to deliver their toxic influence. It provides simple, practical, proven steps that protect us as we develop and apply our escape plan. Written for professionals and those who want to learn more about narcissists and how they operate, the book is an important, accessible, and powerful handbook that demystifies jargon and increases understanding. It shows us how to apply our knowledge to help those suffering at the hands of narcissists, create challenge and a brighter, healthier future free from narcissistic emotional abuse. Narcissism is a global pandemic, seducing business. This is the part I really think is relevant to our podcast, sort of the macro implications of it. Narcissism is a global pandemic, seducing businesses, governments, and cultures with empty promises of status, power, and influence. It is dangerous, remaining hidden in plain sight. Millions are trapped in unseen and untold abusive, narcissistic relationships. Some understand their plight. Others survive from day to day, knowing something is wrong but unable to pinpoint the problem. Most victims conclude that they are the problem, but all need to find a way out. So just a hint, I would love to talk about that because I've heard myself say, we, kind of like cultural ADD, we are living in a sort of cultural narcissism, in my opinion. I used to say, you show me a societal ill and I will trace it back to greed. Lately, I've said, you show me a societal ill and I'll trace it back to narcissism. And I think there's a million ways in which that manifests today. So I really was excited about that last part. Okay, with no further ado, thank you so much for hanging in there, guys. Welcome, Stuart Wood.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me on your show. I'm excited to hear what we talk about.
Yeah, so am I. I think it's still a mystery to even us, but as we say, we do like our rabbit holes and we like going off in the weeds. So I'm very open. Welcome, Virginia.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Woo! Party time. By the
Yeah.
way, where are you exactly? You're in England, right?
I'm in the middle of England, a place called the Midlands. So it really is by name and by nature in the middle of England. So about 125 miles north of London.
Wow, is it green? You and Virginia were kind of talking about the weather when I popped into the room. I'm guessing it's green.
Yes. Yeah, there's where we are, I'm in the middle. I'm a place called Loughborough, which is between Derby, Nottingham and Leicester, which are three local cities. And we have a real privilege because if we go north, we're into the Pennines, which are limestone hills and everything from rolling green countryside to quite austere cliff face. There's a lot of rock climbing on up
That's
there.
not where the cliffs of Dover are, is it?
No, that's right down on the south coast.
So that's kind of limestone, very fertile green against that beautiful bleached out limestone. That's what I was picturing.
Yeah, it's down in Kent or Dover. The limestone is actually a lot softer. It's actually what we call chalk, which is the stuff that you write on blackboards with. So that's a slightly different. It's a slightly softer material, but in Derbyshire there's a thing called limestones, also a thing called millstone grit, which is a very much harder substance and produces a completely different, more sort of austere, craggy landscape. So that's north. South of us is fairly flat. East of us is extremely flat out into the Lincolnshire and the Fens to where a lot of land has been reclaimed from the sea. So it's like the English version of Holland, really, had dikes, and that's where many of the old windmills were. And then to the west, we go through a mixture of green countryside, through foothills, and into the Welsh mountains eventually. So
we're going to get a geography lesson as well.
Well, I like to make it worth your while.
I love it. And here we were talking about tangents and rabbit holes and going off in the weeds, and we're definitely there. But it's good for me. I have a niece that lives in London, and she has been listening. I wouldn't call her an avid listener, but she tunes in. So I don't know if she's been to your area or not. But I'm going to ask about limestone because it came up. I worked in Jerusalem for a few months and learned a lot, tried to learn a lot while I was there. But they obviously quarry a hell of a lot of limestone, and there are ordinances, and there have been here and there, over time, that mandated the use of limestone for pretty much all architecture. Do you see a lot of buildings? I know kind of the old fortresses and abbeys and castles are built out of limestone. Is there any kind of ordinance like that where entire villages or cities are built from that limestone?
It's historically, people were fairly parochial. They stayed where they were and used the local resources. So in Derbyshire, where you find the limestone, you'll find a lot of what we call dry stone walls, which are walls made out of different sized chunks of limestone, but without any water in between. So everything
kind of
is
like ashlar, like ashlar is kind of thrown together, right? Without.
Yes. Yeah, it's basically just one lump of stone put on top of another, and they build it into a rigid structure, and they use these things to line the fields. So limestone is used occasionally for building, but it's quite soft.
Right. Well, and it also doesn't age well. I think it stains very easily. Anyway, here we are.
Yeah, they tend to use the other local stone there from not too far away is millstone grit, which is much harder and resilient to the elements. So you quite often find houses, made out of that, or just local bricks as well. So
right.
But there are a country such as Yorkshire, where there are specifications to retain the heritage, that if you are building a house, it must be built either in or faced with the local stone. So even the new build
Mhm.
blend in with what's already there.
That's what I'm getting at. I
Yeah.
think in Paris, renovation is one of the biggest industries here, especially on the West Coast in LA. We have earthquakes, so that's always the justification for tearing down historic churches. And I like that renovation is a priority, for example, in Paris. And they call it en dur, like building in the old school materials. They're actually more durable than concrete and asphalt. And so, anyway, I appreciate when it's to a fault in Paris. Every outdoor brasserie has to have the same wicker furniture. I don't know about that. That's taken it too far. But, in the Haussmann era, kind of unified the height of the rooftops and all that. Anyway, I appreciate you filling us in because actually life is story, as we say, and context and ambiance, and all of that is relevant. So just yesterday, I recorded what's going to be the episode that comes right before yours in terms of our lineup, and that guest was from Amsterdam. And it's just really fun, hearing kind of about the local color and the culture because I think it's all relevant. So thank you for that. To dovetail off your bio, but also to set the tone and very much in the spirit of our podcast, I'd like to ask a rote question that we've been asking of all of our guests in our new season. Basically, do you have any views or opinions on the role of story in culture? What has story traditionally served in culture, and has that role evolved over time?
I think for me personally, story has been a sort of integral part of my life. Um, and that came about because I was read stories of, certainly as a youngster, read stories of past events. And the
Mm.
stories that I used to love are the ones that gave you part of the scene, if you like, and you had to use your imagination
Mm.
to create the rest of the picture.
Hmm.
And those, going back hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, parables, the old stories that, the whole role of story in taking essentially complex ideas or abstract ideas and making them accessible or understandable. I think, it's as important today as it ever was.
Mm.
As storytelling evolving, um,
On that front, real quick, would you say that, you hinted at it's interactive, your imagination fills in the gaps, or, I would say, I love what you just said about, these are my words, but giving concrete form to principles and ideas and ethics and morals. And I would say that is a big part of what story has done. It's, not just putting a beard on God, but it's literally making the abstract, as Ayn Rand would say, taking concepts and making them percept. But
yes.
anyway, do you feel that modern forms of storytelling, like, I don't know, live action adventure films with exploding helicopters, or even what we're seeing as we scroll through social media, is it as interactive, or are we being spoon fed everything without anything being demanded of the patron?
I think what is happening, and you probably see it a lot more in the States than here in the UK. In the UK, we use a lot of irony and a lot of our
Right.
kind of
God love you.
gloss.
God love your humor.
It's not literal. It sort of uses all kinds of tangential things to, and irony and exaggerating things.
We're
But
not capable. Nuance is not even a
nuance,
thing
yeah.
among new youth, right? Absurdity, irony, completely lost on certain generations. But go on, please.
Yeah, I just think that what's happened is people seem to have become afraid of people not being able to make up their own mind, and so storytelling has developed or regressed, whichever way you look at it, into people having everything explained to them.
Hmm.
So the hard part, the creative part, the innovative part of allowing your mind to wander and create your own image
Hmm.
is increasingly difficult because everything is sort of filled in for you. It's almost because it's almost become like a moral lecture or a lecture on life than a story. I
What?
saw a really interesting article with Clint Eastwood,
Mm-hmm.
that his approach to filmmaking is, so against the
Mm-hmm.
Hollywood ethic,
Well,
I guess, at
yeah,
the
he's,
moment,
yep.
because he tells the story and lets the story tell itself, complete with warts and all, whereas a lot of others try to sanitize it or try to take out the awkward bits and explain them away.
Well, I think there's another layer to it. I would just add to that, there are romantic notions about what constitutes literary value, what constitutes good writing, even in screenwriting, right? So
Yeah.
moralism is generally frowned upon, sentimentality and moralism. So he is the rare individual who does want to get on a soapbox and lecture you in his films. I think he's amazing. I love his films. But you know what you're getting into. It's going to be a rather right-wing conservative view of, geopolitical issues. But there are many circles for many decades now that would say that's really not art, that's didactic. So he's a
Mm.
unique animal. I don't think he's the best example, but I fully am with you. I would say kind of this cultural ADD that I hinted at earlier is part of the problem. Young people do want a quick fix and they do want it explained for them. My brother-in-law is an instructor like I am, and he basically got in trouble at two different institutions because he encouraged them to think for themselves. Go out to a bar, look at the non, he's a communications instructor. Go look at
Mm.
flirting in a bar. See how people flirt. Look at the body language and the nonverbal communication, right? The facial cues. And they weren't, the administration was not down for that. So I've encountered it in my own teaching. They just want it spoon fed without it being an interactive experience. But also nuance is just not even a thing. Like,
Yeah.
for the reasons you mentioned, the whitewashing, the revisionist history, everybody's tiptoe. Yes, especially in this country because we're so litigious. So maybe diversity and inclusion and what is it, Title V, Virginia, Title VI, these new departments that are ushering in the walking on of eggshells. What's the casualty? Nuance. Sorry, I have to preach a little bit, but are we kind of saying the same thing, Stuart? I mean, there's a million reasons why I don't think it's a very participatory experience to be a patron and to take in a story.
I don't know whether it's chicken and egg, isn't it, with some of this?
Mm-hmm.
Because is it that have we created a generation, particularly my own generation, the baby boomers, have we created generations because we had nothing? Have we created generations that almost expect everything
Mm-hmm.
without the hard work? And it's all right pointing a finger at current generations with what they do and don't want, but I think also one of the things of story is that it has a historical element to it, and a lot of it is looking back, and looking back from where we are now. There are a lot of people who've been misled, I think, by the messages that we've preached, the stories that we've told, if you like, where we've created this thing of people's value and people's worth being reflected in what they have, what they own, their status, their title, what people see about them, image, the curated image, celebrity, that kind of thing. And I think these, in this way, storytelling has almost it can become, or it has become, destructive because the stories that we've focused on are not necessarily the narratives that are important for life. They're the narratives that serve the current society, which is create a need and then sell to it.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, what I hear in that, and you already covered a lot of ground there. And you're hinting at narcissism already because I would say the consumerism and the materialism that you hinted at is absolutely, we're training ourselves. I saw a really great meme online when it comes to these latest elections, and I don't want to go off on that tangent, but basically it was a bunch of slugs and snails, and they were shouting, salt for slugs, meaning
Yeah.
we're asking for it. We're custom ordering a pretty grim future. And so I think in one of the interviews I saw from you on YouTube, I forget what the term was, but we are training ourselves into it. Not like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but self-perpetuating or something like that.
We're almost encouraging to condemn ourselves. We're dictating our own end, I think.
Yeah, and I think whenever you indict a younger generation, and I will say people my age are grateful that they can sit at a bus stop without having to have that diversion of doom scrolling rather than just being in the moment and saying hello to the stranger next to you. We're very grateful we have a foundation of very real human connection without needing the diversion or the interim or the surrogate, whatever it is. So it's a very real thing. But you say that to somebody under a certain age, and they're going to say, well, I was born into the world you created. Like my peers,
Yeah.
Virginia and I are from the latchkey generation, and we were famously unparented. So, of course, the pendulum swings, and my peers created monsters by being those helicopter parents, right? And the tiger parents, and swooping in to save their children and protect them from everything. And but I just think every generation blames it on the other one. In the case of the millennials and the Gen Zers, they'll say, yeah, but you created this mess and I was just born into it. And I look and I go, okay, but you really took advantage of, all the materialism and making yourself a brand in social media and reducing all of your assets to basically commodities, or
Yeah.
currency, youth and attractiveness and all those things, having a drink in your hand and your toes in the sand. That is currency.
Yes, and I think if you look at the core, as you've already said, if you look at the core or the foundation of narcissism, it's all about not being my fault, it's someone else. And
Right.
if ever you were after evidence of narcissism creeping in and being accepted by society at a very subtle level, then perhaps that's one of them.
Hmm.
Because one of the strong, and we'll get on, I'm sure we'll get onto this later, but one of the strong components of a narcissist is that they are unable to
Hmm.
accept responsibility for their own actions, and therefore they will blame everyone else. And the whole thing of a blame culture
Hmm.
is very narcissistic. It's not me, it was him.
Right, right. There's so much
Whereas,
irony there because, yeah, one of the things you did say in that very same interview on YouTube was, this idea, the haters, right? What's more
yeah,
ironic than the fact that rather than taking responsibility for your circumstances and conditions, anyone that disagrees with you is a hater, right? And then I think
yeah,
we are so quick to use the word narcissist for anyone that we don't get along with. We're so quick to do that because there is an inability to have a meta self or simply relinquish pride and ego to take responsibility. So, yeah, the whole culture supports that. This whitewashing we're talking about and revisionist history. Anyway, though, before we get into those nuances, because I fully agree, and that's what I meant by cultural narcissism. There's a
yeah,
million ways in which it's self-perpetuating. But before we do that, maybe you could define some terms because I do
yeah.
feel like it's a little bit irresponsible. Even me, I want to know what the clinical diagnoses actually are. And I know you've spoken about how narcissism is a gamut, or a scale, and how we all have it to a certain degree, but there is a tipping point where it becomes narcissistic personality disorder. Would you mind giving us a real quick breakdown, like narcissism for dummies, in terms of terminology?
Yeah, as you say, we all have narcissistic characteristics, and these are those that you deem selfish, where we use them to get what we need. It's part of our kind of survival in the world, and it's an important part of us. But we have empathy,
Mm,
which is that ability to appreciate how our words and actions impact other people, or particularly the person that we're speaking to. And so when we get a bit narcissistic, when we get a bit over the top, if someone says to us, whoa, that was out of order, what we do is we take a step back, assess where we are, and we say, yep, sorry, I shouldn't have done that. Sorry if I upset you, I didn't mean to. And there's that ability to self-reflect
hmm.
and also try and resolve the situation. When it comes to narcissists, they have no empathy. And therefore, how their words and actions impact other people,
Hmm.
it doesn't bother them,
Hmm.
for want of a better expression. If it upsets the other person, that's the other person's fault. It's for them to deal with. It can't possibly be the narcissist's fault, because the narcissist is incapable of making mistakes
Hmm.
in their own mind, or at least that's what they kind of present to the world.
Hmm.
So we have narcissistic characteristics, but we balance those with empathy. When it comes to narcissism itself, just because someone is selfish, rude, blanks you, goes quiet on you, these sorts of behaviors, tells you they don't like you, etc., that doesn't make them a narcissist. But a narcissist is made up of those sorts of things. So it's like the the statistical manual, the DSM, Diagnostical and Statistic Manual for Psychiatric Diseases, lists 9 different qualities, which include things like highly entitled, have a grandiose sense of your own self, so the inflated sense of self.
Hmm.
Um, they are they can be very easily provoked, so they will
Hmm.
go from 0 to 100 in in half a second. So their
Hmm.
ability to control emotions is not good. And there are 9 of these sort of characteristics, which for an actual clinical diagnosis of narcissism, you only need 5 or more
Right.
to be diagnosed with this thing called Narcissistic Personality Disorder,
Right.
NPD,
Hmm.
which is a clinical diagnosis.
Hmm. Can
The
I jump in?
problem,
And I want to ask a
yeah,
question real
yeah,
quick.
yeah,
I know, like with alcoholism, one of the defining factors is, because you have social drinkers, you have people that say, I don't have a problem. Uh, I think one of the defining characteristics always is, yes, but does it impact your own ability, to achieve your goals or to manifest, or simply does it interrupt your daily functioning? So I think in that same interview, you kind of hinted that, I mean, the word toxic comes up. It does seem to,
yes,
like with those 5 of 9 traits, for example, suddenly it impacts your relationships, or it's simply, I don't know, I'm using my words, counterproductive in terms of fulfillment or tranquility and peace and, well-being. And so, but to me, I hear a little bit of like, ooh, it's subjective, it's in the eye of the beholder when you use words like toxic. Is it true that's one of the defining factors, is it's interrupting your daily functioning or affecting your relationships, that sort of thing? Because
yes,
toxic to
yeah.
me is in the eye of the beholder.
I think another word that's used, certainly in relation to narcissism, is the word pathology or pathological.
Hmm. Yeah, when does it become pathological? What are the
So when narcissism, or when one's behavior and actions begins to influence the behaviors, opinions, and actions of another person, that's when you're getting into toxicity.
Mhm.
Because I think, we all have bad days when we suddenly go off on one and then realize we've upset someone, and we can apologize. But with narcissism, this is a persistent
Mhm.
and continual approach to other people. So if you want to sum narcissism up in one simple sentence, it's basically you and the rest of the world and everyone in it is here to serve me.
Right.
That's how the narcissist views society. End of. There's no nuance outside of that.
Mhm.
Everything and everyone exists.
Everything is an object, right? The
Yeah,
word solipsism is a word that I use in my writing. Solipsism is you're the only real entity, everything else is an object. And I
yes,
would say that's the ultimate in isolation. So a moment ago, I think you hinted at sociopathy too. That's why I want to clean up our language just for our purposes on this podcast. I know vanity, arrogance, those words get conflated with true narcissism, actually, quite a bit. And then you get into solipsism, where maybe there's a degree of isolation, so everything becomes an object there for your manipulation. But then sociopathy, I think you said something earlier about a complete lack of empathy. And I thought, well, that's sociopathic at that point. Can you talk to those terms a little bit? Arrogance,
Yes.
vanity, egocentrism. Even in French, you hear, oh, il est égoïste. He's an egoist. You hear that a lot. And of course, everything is culturally relative too, in terms of what we get away with. So anyway, maybe some of
Yes.
those terms,
Yeah.
do they get conflated in pop culture?
I think, I think the important thing with when you come to words like sociopath or sociopathy is a combination of narcissism, which is this total inability to appreciate the impact you're having on people whilst willfully manipulating others to get what you want from them, regardless of the cost to them. And that overlaps with a thing known as antisocial behavior
Mm-hmm.
disorder, which is another clinical diagnosis. And so in the sociopaths, very often what you're seeing is a mixture of narcissism along with sadism, stroke,
Right.
enjoying seeing other people suffer. So
Right.
narcissism's on a
Mm.
spectrum, even just as toxicity is on a spectrum. So narcissism is also on a kind of spectrum from mildly toxic, but still toxic because by definition it's narcissistic, through to where the narcissist is willingly and by design hurting people without
Mm-hmm.
remorse.
Mm-hmm.
And though there's been work done on the profile, if you like, of mass killers, so people
Mm-hmm.
who
Right.
get caught in the school shootings, etc.,
Right. Mm-hmm.
and covert narcissists, which often move into they're sort of a little more sneaky about how they do it,
Mm-hmm.
but it moves into this realm where there's an element of sadism. And if you look at the personality profiles of people who are covert narcissists and those who are mass killers, they're actually very, very similar.
Mm-hmm.
And what that, for me, that's a warning that when you're dealing with these people, when you're dealing with narcissists, when the term narcissist is used, it should be used only in those situations where
I guess
someone's actions
I.
and words
Mm-hmm.
are sufficiently toxic or affect the other person that they can lose identity of who they are, they can lose all self-confidence, they can lose their reason for living,
Right.
really.
It's
And combined with this,
let's get into the relationship dynamics in a moment. And
yeah,
yes, I think some have juxtaposed narcissists and empaths as being magnets to one another. So, but the reason you're really hinting at the reason I wanted to clean up the language, because I do think it's irresponsible to conflate terminology because it kind of normalizes it, if that makes sense. And, even with the Me Too movement, I think there was a moment where it became very clear we need to reserve potent words like assault for assault. If
yeah,
it's workplace harassment, let's be very clear about that. And I think it's a disservice, frankly, and maybe you could speak to that, to throw around these words in pop culture irresponsibly. Does that make sense a little bit?
yes,
Because the
yeah,
proper attention doesn't go where it needs to go.
yes, and it is very much it's that it comes back to the storytelling element, I think,
Mm-hmm.
here that
Mm-hmm.
when we talked about stories before, the whole point of the stories was it allowed you to think for yourself, but there was sufficient in there to allow you to come to the right conclusion. So if it was a fable, you at the end of it, you might have imagined the story looking slightly different, but you
Mm-hmm.
came to the right conclusion. And I think
It's
the problem with using narcissism as a generic term, it's a bit like using hoovering instead of vacuuming. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Oh, I
It's
see. Yeah,
almost
yeah,
like
exactly.
something specific, the Hoover that was
Right.
created by
Or a
hoovering.
Q-tip as a cotton swab. we
Yes,
we take brand
exactly.
names. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well,
you're
but it
almost
also
taking
it muddies the waters, is what I would say, and it's
yes.
happening right now with the fires. You have AI images of the Hollywood sign on fire. You know what, folks? It's not on fire. And then you have everything being politicized or sensationalized otherwise, and it actually make inhibits the ability to be helpful. I just posted on Facebook before we started this a list of lies from the right about Gavin Newsom and why the fire hydrants didn't work. I think when something catastrophic happens, we want really elaborate explanations for it. So that's human nature. But politicizing is another story. So anyway, it just muddies the waters, and it's harder to truly diagnose somebody and help somebody in a toxic relationship. So sorry if you have more to say, just steer it back on your own. But it might be a good time to ask you about your story. What drove you to really learn more about narcissism and write your book?
I was I was in hospital, ironically. I had a heart attack and heart surgery, and I was back in hospital for some complications. And if you were looking for the ideal person for people to talk to without fear of coming back, it's either the hairdresser or the hospital patient. So I had people coming to me, and what you hear, they just felt safe to offload. And one particular friend came and just shared what was going on in the marriage. And I'd known them both for about 11 years or so. And I'd heard the odd little story from her over the time. But when she actually brought it all together as to how she felt, how she was treated, how she felt totally disempowered, etc., there were alarm bells going off left, right, and centre in my head. And she was saying, "Look, I just think it's over, but I don't know how to go about it. I don't know about whether I should leave. I want to leave, but what will happen?" And I just said rather naively, "Well, whatever you choose to do, I'll I'll support you, basically."
It
And
sounds good
that
to
was
me.
yeah, but that was the beginning of 4 years of hell, for her and for myself. And that really showed me, if you like, the side of narcissism that the general public don't see. Because narcissists have two faces. They have this, what they call the mask, or, an image that they like to project to the outside world, which is all about being confident, all about being good and altruistic, and supporting the community and supporting charitable causes, and all things which people view as good and actually are good. But underneath it all, they are incredibly insecure. They hate themselves and they actually hate everybody else.
Mm.
And when you're starting from that point to build relationships, the chances of building a healthy relationship are pretty slim. Which is why, when you were saying about the fires and the AI and the false information, one of the really dominant things with narcissism, which actually came out in this particular instance that I was helping, was this thing they call gaslighting,
Yes, yes, of course.
which is, again, it's another term that bounces around.
Exactly.
But
Yep.
gaslighting is actually a psychological weapon that's used against other people. By denying their reality, they actually doubt their own reality
Mhm.
until eventually they rely on you, the abuser, totally for their direction, because they are convinced that they're no longer capable of making decisions for themselves.
Mhm.
And so when you get societal narcissism or political narcissism, and that's your route,
Mhm.
it's not going to end well,
Right,
and
right.
it's a different story. But basically, when those are the influences that you are under daily from the people who are ruling the country,
Oh, yeah.
you know what I
Well,
mean? And
that's what I was actually, sorry, Virginia, I want you to jump in, but
Yeah.
that's kind of what I was going to steer it toward is, I mean, what better example in terms of self-aggrandization, objectifying, just basically all ego all the time. We've got a world leader who is normalizing that. So I remember back when, what's that game show called? You are the weakest link, be gone,
Yeah,
the
Hmm.
yeah,
weakest link. I remember my friend Mark was like, oh my God, even our daily discourse is shifting because it's suddenly okay, right? You have a rude host, and we just don't even, like fish in the boiling water, don't even, I guess crabs in the boiling water, don't even notice the cultural shift in how we relate to one another. So, yes, this is the ultimate normalization of narcissism, the
yeah.
political landscape. Sorry.
It is, and I think the reason I went on to that is that that becomes normalized in whatever situation it manifests and therefore becomes accepted. And so the background noise goes up, we don't notice it's there, it
Hmm.
becomes the normal, and
Right.
then it allows them to take the next step. And that's exactly how narcissists work within a relationship, because this
See?
particular person that I was helping,
Hmm.
throughout the time she was desperately trying to get away, you realize, how these people will lie compulsively.
Hmm.
So even to the point, not in my case, but another friend who went round to see a lady who was concerned that her husband may be narcissistic. The guy made them drinks, and my friend said, I actually watched him put coffee in 3 cups, and he gave them their coffees, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to enjoy a cup of tea." And his wife said, "No, I've just seen you put coffee." And he goes, "No, no, this is tea. You've got it wrong. You've not seen it properly." And my
Wow.
friend and my
It-
my friend said, "No, I've just watched you put a cup of coffee, a spoonful of coffee in there as well. It's got to be coffee." And he said, "No, smell it. Here, have a smell." And she said, "I smelt it, and it was coffee." She said, "Yeah, it's coffee." He goes, "No, no, no, you're wrong. It's tea." And
It
so
sounds a
you've
little bit
got
like, being able to accept the results of an election. you know,
it's
you
well,
talk
I
your,
think
if you say it enough, it's true.
it's also the fact that part of their way of operating is to so distort the truth or
Right.
perception of truth in the other person that they can get away with it.
I want to go
And
back to gaslighting a little bit
yes, of
because we're
course.
talking about the muddying of the waters. You hinted at the noise, and
Yeah.
that's why I mentioned being crabs in the boiling water, right? It's the same phenomenon. We don't recognize it when the stakes are actually high. And so I just wanted to say I've found the term gaslighting very helpful. I'll just give you an example. If you're experiencing ageism, you're not allowed to talk about it because when you do, I work in animation and it's run by 12-year-olds. I'm sorry, I'm 56 and my opportunities are very limited due strictly to my age. Now, I can build a story around that, right? But people that have, and I have a black friend that even way back in the 90s, he had to educate me on the stereotypes. I had no real inkling. And he would say, I've never identified as a victim. I've never given airtime to any of that. And so we all have our own experience. But I think basically when you speak up, and it is a culture right now, right, of speaking up or rage against the machine, call it what you want. Me Too is an example of it or symptomatic of it. But when you speak up against the powers that be, you are often gaslit. Oh
Mm.
no, I've had a great experience. Well, if you're lucky enough to not have been affected by ageism, or for example, been fired right before you're fully vested in your benefits, if you've been lucky enough, then just thank the Lord and move on. You don't gaslight people that have, you know what I mean, fallen victim to it.
Yeah.
Does
I want
that
to say,
example make any sense? Go ahead, Virginia.
well, I was gonna say, I think that you not only get gaslit, but they also block you. They try and shut down your own intuition of what you're
Mm,
seeing, and
mm-hmm,
so I think it's helping people to not trust intuitively their own inner awareness of what they're
mm-hmm,
seeing. So people
absolutely.
aren't wanting to speak out because they're doubting that
That's
internal
the ultimate
compass.
usurping of power too, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a
Exactly.
relationship. But
Yeah.
I guess I was hinting at there's some irony here because I'm part of the problem and not the solution, and that I do use the word gaslighting in probably low stakes situations when I shouldn't. But the irony is maybe that's why people dig in their heels in a very unexamined way and start using these terms irresponsibly. Because you know what I mean? When gaslighting is a form of normalization, when it's not clinical narcissism. Then you have the other side kind of digging in their heels and identifying as an empath, or really calling out narcissism. And I want to go down this road a little bit. Again, let's just call me part of the problem and not the solution, but I'm very open to being educated. Of course, I have a friend like yours who has absolutely been crying narcissism for several years now. And yeah, the tough love part of me is like, get the fuck out and put your violins away. You know what I mean? And it takes two to tango, and your dynamic put you exactly where you are. So I'm really big on, taking responsibility. We all manifest our thoughts and feelings. What do you give airtime to? It's very convenient culturally to just accuse, like you said, everybody of being a hater or being a narcissist. But then there is true clinical narcissism. So I'm trying to be patient and be compassionate, and you were really there for your friend. When is it, you know what I mean? Pull yourself up by the bootstraps, take responsibility for contributing to this dynamic. I mean, I happen to know there are peptide addictions, and we will find, I've said, sorry, Virginia, on this podcast, a codependent will find an alcoholic across the room because they have a peptide addiction. So, how do these self professed empaths magically find a narcissist? And what is their responsibility level?
That's a great question. I think when you're going to the opposite extremes or opposite poles of the scale, like narcissist and empath, then there is, dysfunction at both ends. The empath is desperate for someone to put their, to lavish their love and their feelings on, and the narcissist is desperate for that. So they're almost like a perfect lock and key
Right.
and fit together. So if you were looking for the ideal match for a narcissist, it would be someone who gives them what they've not got, which is most things when it comes to human interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So if you find an empathetic person, then the narcissist will latch on to them.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly those who are more empathetic, because quite often they're not good at setting boundaries.
Right, right.
Narcissists have no boundaries, and if you have them, they'll just try and continually trample over them. Someone who's in a healthier position will say, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that, or I'm not accepting that. That's unacceptable behavior. Empaths are not used to having boundaries in place either.
Right.
And therefore they're almost like the perfect narcissist fodder, really.
Right.
But when it comes to a narcissistic relationship, it's victim blaming is actually very, very dangerous, simply because the way the narcissist works on them, as Virginia's already alluded to, is that they use the same process that someone uses you to get hooked in or addicted to gambling or to alcohol. It's this intermittent reinforcement. So they'll
do you
give
feel
you a
that
good
it's completely subconscious and unexamined on the part of the narcissist, or do they have a textbook? Do they have a manual?
This is their reason for living almost.
Modus operandi.
Modus operandi without doubt. It's calculated.
There's two questions because we're kind of all over the place in a very good way. But just before I forget, I don't want to forget this question. And now we've hinted at it yet again. Is it a manual or is it all unexamined? And if they don't have a meta self, then it could very easily be completely egocentric and unexamined. But I guess what I wanted to ask is, a complete lack of empathy. We hinted too that healthy narcissism is the ego doing its job and protecting us. And then it kind of lapses into sort of being out of balance in some cases. So I guess I would ask, a complete lack of empathy sounds a little bit like your mom didn't do her job. So what is the role of nature and nurture if we all have the capacity to get out of balance or out of whack on this front? When is it a moral or ethical issue? When did, the hand that rocks the cradle not do her job or his job?
Yeah. that's another question. If I could answer that, I'd be able to retire on a president's salary.
Well, but what is the
There-
current thinking on it? Is it,
well,
are you just a
it's
bad seed when you're a narcissist, or did something fail in your socialization or your conditioning?
there is no doubt that narcissists have suffered trauma in their past life. Now, part of that may be that they were abused, that they
Right.
were, you know, emotionally abused or physically abused. They've basically learnt that they are not really worth anything, and the only way they can be accepted is by what they achieve. So nothing is free.
Right.
It all has to be earned, and that becomes a driving force within them. That means that when the narcissist is, when they're looking for that kind of validation,
Right.
really,
Yep.
they are desperate for people to validate them,
Yes.
because certainly as children, they want what ordinary children need, love,
I think
care,
we're all
attention.
picturing the same orange asshole, right, Virginia?
Well, yeah,
I mean, his
like
daddy just didn't love him, and it's so clear.
well, I wouldn't say it's not that they're not loved, because you can have, and I'm speaking from a case study that I actually worked on in my master's program that our professor threw at us, on narcissism, for us to understand the personality disorder within the DSM-5. But in this particular person was loved by their family. There was no physical abuse or anything like that. It was more of high expectations within the family. And so
Well, that's Trump. Sorry, go.
so basically the where I'm going with this is, so if you come from a family where you don't learn your own internal
Yep.
validation, it's only external validation. So your only self-worth comes from meeting these high expectations. The only time you hear your family loves you is because you won your tennis match, because you got the you got all A's on your report card, and that's the only time you hear that you're loved, even though your family does love you. But that's the only time you hear that validation, that external validation, and you don't learn how to internally validate yourself.
You've talked a little bit about is it oxytocin addiction, or is it, what's the neurochemical when you
Oh,
achieve?
Dopamine.
Is it a dopamine rush when you get that
Mhm.
validation through accomplishment?
Right. And so they live on that. And so basically, like for our case study, this person, they literally, their grades were falling in college. They failed they made it into the nationals. They failed the national match for tennis. And so therefore they could never play tennis again. And it was all their professors' faults that they were now failing college. And they could not, they had no self-awareness where their part played in it. So there is that dynamic too in a narcissist.
I love that you brought that up because, and again, in listening to Stuart's other interviews, I very much thought that we all have either an, as we've talked about on this podcast, internal or external locus of control, but we also have either intrinsic value or we are reliant on extrinsic validation for our self-worth. So, to what degree do we innately hinge on intrinsic or extrinsic validation? And, within one family, I think you can have all those extremes. I mean, I have 3 siblings, and we all reacted differently to our environment. If there's high expectations in a family, that doesn't guarantee you're going to get a narcissistic personality out of it.
I was just, it's very interesting. Thank you, Virginia, for your your lucid thoughts. You put into words a lot quicker than I would have done when I got round to it. So thank you. But yeah, what I was getting at really was that there are also cases where the trauma in the child comes from being spoiled, getting everything they want, and
Wow.
therefore they feel disempowered to make their own decisions.
Wow.
And they also become highly entitled, and therefore the expectation is that everybody's their servant.
Right.
Now, in each of those situations, the abused child, stroke, whether that's emotionally abused or physically abused, or the spoilt child, exactly as you've said, you can have 2 or 3 people. Let's say you've got 3 children in a dysfunctional family. they may grow up to be narcissistic. They may grow up to be empathetic because they decide that they're not going to be anything like the narcissist, and because they've lacked the input emotionally, they go out, they almost want to feel it and crave it, and they feel everybody else's emotion because that's what they're used to feeling as they're watching their siblings being dealt with by the narcissist. And some of those people turn up, perfectly normal.
It's like a
So
cycle. It sounds like a
you've
cycle
got
breaker a little bit.
the normal, the narcissist, and even perhaps the empath, potentially from the same family. So the feeling, I think, at the moment, the general opinion is that they don't know. Nurture definitely has something to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Nature, your environment, certainly has can influence it, and there's also a possible genetic link, because there, for example, there's evidence of generational narcissism. But whether that's not actually specific genetics where the gene code, there is a narcissism gene that codes. It's more what they call epigenetics.
Right.
So it's how
the circumstances and conditions create the methyl groups that express the gene, or allow it to express itself or not. I mean, it's fascinating. We'll never get to the bottom of nature versus nurture, but what I'm hearing a little bit is like whatever your innate disposition and temperament is determines how you react to the conditions in your household. And thank God we have all of the above, right?
Yeah. The one thing they do know, just to speak on the epigenetic side of it, is there is a resilient gene that they have identified, and that does help when you're in these types of environments growing up. If you have that genetic code marker for resiliency, you tend to fare better and to be more well-rounded as an individual. If you have experienced any type of trauma, be it a spoiled child, a child of abuse, of any kind of abuse, and I mean physical to emotional, on the whole spectrum, you tend to fare better if that is in your genetic DNA.
You spoke about resiliency in some of the interviews that I listened to. Is that right, Stuart? I mean, you had your own definition of resiliency. Do you have anything to say on that?
I think going back to the question of, or the point about social media and the common cultural misconceptions and things. At the moment, because people are in a position where they can just switch off the phone, block a friend, use technology for communication, then that face-to-face interaction, the human, the personal interaction with all its facets of body language and face and everything, and nuance, is gone. And therefore, what you're doing is creating a generation of people who are not resilient.
Wow, yeah.
And so somebody disagrees with you and it goes to, well, you don't agree with me, so you're a hater. And that is such a narcissistic perspective, because they see things in binary, it's a one or a naught.
Right. And the same thing with calling another a narcissist. There's nothing more narcissistic than applying that label to somebody you just simply disagree with.
Exactly. And actually, there's a pretty good chance, if you're worried about being a narcissist, there's a pretty good chance you're not one. If someone is banding the word narcissist around, that is a very common reaction of the narcissist in deflecting the attention from themselves.
Well, and we saw that in the political campaign. I know you are, but what am I, right? They call it whataboutism. If you get accused of something as a left-wing Democrat, there's always, well, what about this? And you just turn it around. Hector projector. Yeah. That's politics in a nutshell.
Yeah. There's a thing called DARVO, which is an acronym, DARVO, which is used a lot in this sort of, arena of narcissism, which is basically deny, accuse, reverse victim, and offender. And so what they do, if you catch a narcissist out, the first thing they'll do is that they will deny it, but then rapidly they'll turn it round on you. So you then become the problem in the situation, and then mysteriously they become the victim and you become the abuser. And that is that's a classic narcissist or narcissistic tactic for deflecting blame, for deflecting accountability. Apart from blaming other people, they will very quickly turn it on you. And suddenly, from you might make the simplest and most benign of comments, but because you happen to touch a sensitive area with these people, you suddenly find yourself being attacked by them and claiming that you're being insensitive, and you just want to hate them, and you want them out of your life, and all this sort of rubbish that comes out that you've not even thought of. And that also in itself is a disorientating response.
Yeah, it's complete diversion.
When you're on the receiving end of that, very few people are able to sit there and say, oh, hang on, this is obviously Darvo in operation here.
Yes.
And
well, I do hope our listeners are kind of tracing it back to the political landscape, because these are literally textbook tactics when political campaigning in an election cycle. And you see it alive and well. So not only is it the diversion tactic, look at this shiny object over here instead of the real issue, but
yes.
But it's literally like the victim. How can you be sent by God for some of your constituents as the second coming of Christ and also be a victim? It's so on display at this moment, and I'll leave it at that.
When you come to narcissists, though, the word logic doesn't apply.
Right.
Because the whole essence of being in a narcissistic relationship or being subject to narcissism is this whole thing of them disorientating truth, alternative truth, however you want to define it.
Fake news.
It's the guy basically saying his cup of coffee is tea.
Right.
They actually use this as a weapon against you.
But the fact that over 50% of our population can't see that is the scary part. And that's the evidence of the cultural narcissism.
I was kind of curious for those of us, who do recognize that, we're obviously, experiencing these situations, or, can see that this is happening around us. What would you say would be, some of the things that we can do to help bring ourselves to acknowledge it and to bring ourselves back into balance, to rediscover our own potential, to help bring us back to that human connection, to move us forward into a more positive narrative?
Individually or culturally, or both?
Both. Individually and collectively. Yeah.
Well, one hopes, the ripple effect.
Yeah, I think there are it's a bit like a business strategy. There's short-term goals, and then there's long-term goals, or a long-term aim. The long-term aim, if you are trapped within a narcissistic relationship, is basically to be free and out of touch with that narcissist. That's where they call it no contact. It's basically leave, have nothing to do with them. But that's an ideal. And narcissists are brilliant involving children. They'll have children for the sole purpose of keeping their partner attached to them, because obviously they're entitled to parental rights as the partner is. And if you want to see narcissism really at work, go into the family courts over over that kind of thing. So if ideal situation is to get away, but also not everyone can do that, and therefore it's learning to deal with what's happening to you on a daily basis. So it doesn't really matter whether it's full-blown narcissism, whether it's covert, any of the different manifestations of it. The thing to understand is that if you are in a relationship that's high conflict, and where you are doubting yourself, where you're doubting you just don't feel as though you're the person you were, you actually doubt your sanity, things like that, that's a pretty good indicator that something's wrong. But you still have to deal with it at that moment in time. The approach really is to diffuse interaction. So we all get that's a euphemism. I won't say that. I'll go back. Many of us
Mm,
feel that if someone says something to us that's inappropriate, we have to point it out to them. Well,
mm,
conflict to a narcissism is this thing that we talked about earlier, supply. It's that external
mm,
validation that
mm,
they want. A narcissist is a child in an adult's body. So they are basically the emotion, you're dealing with the emotions of a child.
yes.
And therefore, when you come to reason with them, you're reasoning with anything between a 2 and a 7-year-old,
Okay, I'm so glad you
'cause-
said a narcissist is a child in an adult body because my brain is going to making connections throughout, and I feel like I just have to say this in the spirit of our podcast. So it might seem irresponsible, like I said, or kind of throwing these terms around fast and loose, but a big part of this podcast is reconciling very Newtonian, mechanistic, and in this case, clinical views of narcissism with empowering people right in their own lives to actually take responsibility, and then again through the ripple effect we hope there's a shift culturally or even in terms of policy. But I'm sitting here going, okay, a lot of this just sounds like what's called emotional maturity and maturation and spiritual evolution, and maybe there is a phenomenon, and I'm just making connections here. Maybe you guys will relate to it or have something to say about it or not. But I do think that is the spirit of our podcast. The stories we tell ourselves empower us. So if you think about a child that throws a tantrum when he or she doesn't get what they want, that's the ultimate in egocentrism. So I can't help but see the orange asshole as a child stamping his feet all day, every day. He was stunted in his growth. I don't know if you view, Stuart, narcissism as a form of stunting of emotional maturity, or I'm calling it spiritual evolution. But I tie everything back to Virginia. Wouldn't you agree on this podcast? It always comes back to love. Everything
Yes.
always comes
Yeah.
back to love.
I
And
think
and what that is, and we talk about the moment.
mhm.
We talk about connecting with one's core essence or spiritual essence by stilling the mind. And so it always just comes back to relinquishing ego, quieting the mental chatter, finding your core, and that is called love. So I'm sitting here going, everything would be solved if we grew up. We have a Peter Pan syndrome in this culture. We suck the teat of youth. Now I'm really preaching, but we suck the teat of youth. We value it over all else. We try to extend childhood as long as possible to the point where people are missing out on what my sister, who's been on the podcast, would call the inner realm, the inner development. So we talk the talk. We talk about, right, self-help, and we talk about self-improvement. But how many people really are having those rites of passage where you learn the lessons that get you past this egocentric behavior? I can't help but see narcissism as a cultural fixation with youth.
I was just thinking life experience. We don't value life experience like we used to.
There's no currency to wisdom, it's called,
Mhm.
right? That comes with a life experience. You're speaking
And
my
and
language.
it's funny because I was just and this is so I was just watching the most recent on Netflix with my youngest daughter. My husband and I were just watching the most recent. We like Fluffy, so
Tell me,
it-
Fluffy, should I know
yeah,
who Fluffy is?
Fluffy is Gabriel Iglesias. He's a comedian.
Okay, okay.
So and he actually was just talking about this in his comedy show on Netflix, but he was talking about um because we have social media and just how everything's just instantly we can Google information. And I'm not and he says he actually says this, that the youth, because they can Google stuff up, they can just look things up versus rely on, like when we were growing up, because he's of our generation, the latchkey kids, that we grew up where when we had to take accountability for ourselves, you respected your elders no matter what your culture was, did not matter, you respected your elders, point blank.
Mhm.
And that, I don't want to say that hasn't really passed down to the millennials or the Gen Zers and so forth, but it seems that viewpoint is slightly different
Mhm.
to some degree now, because with technology in play, I guess I would say.
Mhm.
um and so because of that, the way we view life experience is different, um and the way we respect it, I guess,
Mhm.
because we can use technology to gain that information at a younger
Everything's
age.
theoretical in a way, right? Like we've
Mm-hmm.
talked on this podcast, but I grew, I drank from the hose, and I don't have a third arm yet, and I ate dirt,
Right.
and it helped my immune system. Like the play thing that Greg Spolenko was talking about when he was on
Yeah.
too. We go out and, now the erector, if they even exist, the Legos and the erector sets build themselves. Yeah.
But I think it even goes back to what Stuart said at the very beginning when you asked, our typical rote question about story. When we look at fables, when we read fables and stuff, because we didn't have technology, we had to rely on our own brain, our
That's
own.
what I mean. Creativity and imagination only
Right.
occurs when you have
Mhm.
when you get out of that fucking house.
Right.
Sorry.
No, exactly. And so you can't go to ChatGPT and say, "Hey, I just read, To Kill a Mockingbird, and this is kind of what I thought it said. What do you think it means? Because this is what I'm thinking. Am I right?" And it can validate what your
Mhm.
thoughts are. You
Right.
can't. We couldn't
Right.
do that as kids. We had to put that on paper, submit it to our teacher, and go, "Please give me an A, at least
Right.
a
Well,
C."
one of our earliest guests, I don't know if you remember this, but one of our earliest guests was talking about exactly that, how she was tutoring a child. I'm hoping you'll remember this. Tutoring a child. And in order to comprehend what one reads, one actually benefits from constructing a sentence for once in their life, and the act of writing helps in your comprehension. And the parent said, I'm paying you to teach my child how to read, not write. Why did you inconvenience my child by forcing them to write? It's such a short-sighted mentality because we miss out on those skills when it's not an interactive experience and things are spoon-fed to us. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I agree.
But you
But
brought up myth, and I'm going to take advantage of that. Stuart, if we missed out on some of the talking points you wanted to hit on, or anything you were really motivated to impart, we can always do a part two. But I see an opportunity here. On second listen, this is going to be much more linear. We bounced around a lot, but I think it's really valuable stuff. But maybe we could do a part two and get into some nitty gritty. But if you don't mind, if you guys could indulge me, you mentioned myth. So, again, in the spirit of story, I want to read the initial myth of Narcissus and Echo. And granted, I'm not reading the Latin version. It's been interpreted. Who knows how it's been bastardized? But I'm reading a version of it, and I just want to see what you guys have to say about the implications. What does it say about the human condition? What do the archetypes say about all of us? I think I got this version of it from Ovid, of course, which was Latin, but I think this is like maybe the really dumbed down version. I don't remember if I got it from Google's AI response or from Wikipedia. But basically, we're jumping in, and I have this opinion that sometimes the myths can be taken in isolation, and they're still very powerful in what they communicate about the human condition. But you also have to consider them in context. So this is plucked out with no context, and I apologize for that. But the version I have from Ovid's poem Metamorphoses. As a punishment, Juno and Hera both took from Echo her agency and speech. I don't know what she did, but clearly she's being punished. Echo was
Talk too much.
okay. Really, this is cruel and unusual punishment. Echo was thereafter never able to speak unless it was to repeat the last few words of those she heard. Echo had deceived using gossip. I guess that was her crime. She would be condemned to be only that from then on. Meanwhile, Echo spied Narcissus, separated from his hunting companions, and she became immediately infatuated, following him and waiting for him to speak so her feelings might be heard. Narcissus sensed he was being followed and shouted, "Who's there?" Echo repeated, "Who's there?" While this interaction continued, Echo came close enough so that she was revealed and attempted to embrace him. Horrified, he stepped back and told her to keep her chains. Don't know what that means exactly. Heartbroken, Echo wasted away, losing her body amidst lonely glens until nothing of her but chaste verbal ability remained. Nemesis, the goddess of revenge, heard the pleas of a young man, Emenius, who had fallen for Narcissus but was ignored and cursed him. Nemesis listened, proclaiming that Narcissus would never be able to be loved by the one he fell in love with. After spurning Echo and the young man, Narcissus became thirsty. He found a pool of water that no animal had ever approached. Leaning down to drink, Narcissus saw his reflection, which he found as beautiful as a marble statue. Not realizing it was his own reflection, Narcissus fell deeply in love with it. Thus, both Tiresia's prophecy and Nemesis's curse came true in the same instance. Unable to leave the allure of this image, Narcissus eventually realized that his love could not be reciprocated, and he melted away from the fire of passion burning inside of him, eventually turning into a golden white flower now known as the narcissus or the daffodil. Bam. Anything at all come to mind in terms of interpreting that for, the human condition in general? I have an opinion when you take all the characters of, you name it, a dream or a myth as aspects of your own psyche. I have an opinion that's a little bit different than the academic one on this poem because I see all the characters as aspects of a single psyche. Anyway, thoughts come to mind on the symbolism of that, Stuart or Virginia, either way?
I personality-wise, both, looking at the interaction between Narcissus and Echo, for whatever reason, Echo was looking for love and affirmation and a life partner, but Narcissus decided that he wouldn't give that. I mean, I think in the story it talks about him telling her that she's got no chance, basically, but she's unable to initially accept that, but then eventually, as it dawns in, she wastes away. So you've got this thing that narcissists will, at their core, they really are repelling everybody. They daren't get close to anybody, and they daren't really even when they do express love or affection or whatever, it's not out of the place that we normally understand. It's a need.
It's got an end game.
Yes, it's basically got a, it's not love for love's sake, it's love because it'll get me something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in this, in this particular story, Narcissus is that is just, it just characterizes so much the approach of the narcissist that they are self-loathing in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they all have a deep self-hatred for themselves and for other people, so they're high in control and will dictate what happens. The other person has no say in what happens, even though they might think they do. The narcissist is brilliant at extracting the life from the other person, about converting the person's life into having no purpose. So they themselves, the victim, withers into a shadow of their former self.
Mm-hmm.
But then this whole thing of looking at himself in the mirror, I find quite ironic, because the whole thing with narcissists is that although they project this image of perfection and idealism, these grandiose aims and everything else, that's exactly who they're not. It's almost that what they're seeing in the reflection is what it's how they see themselves, but they can't get at that. You know what I mean? So he can't get at himself in that reflection. He can't touch.
We used to call it just deep insecurity, right? It's called insecurity. Yeah.
Yeah, crippling insecurity, I think Dr. Romani calls it.
But here, I failed to say this earlier, and I want to kind of slip it in. When I was talking about egocentrism, I do think once you differentiate from the mother and you realize, as Andrea said, remember that, Virginia, you realize you're two separate entities. But once you differentiate from the mother, I think we're all egocentric. It's me, me, me. Children are famous for that. But you learn to live in the world, and hopefully your mother teaches you empathy and identification. But I wanted to ask a while ago, is it possible, and I think you hinted that it was, that a narcissist can have theoretical empathy or compassion? They can be aware of how their actions affect others emotionally or, literally. But then it's a choice not to give that any credence or value. And that just sounds evil. I mean, is it possible for a narcissist to have empathy at all and still choose not to honor it and still choose to manipulate for their own purposes? To what degree is a narcissist capable of empathy?
I was gonna say, are you asking, can a narcissist basically be treated? Is essentially what you're asking? Like, can
No,
they?
no, I just heard over and over again that I mean that's almost the definition of narcissism is to lack empathy.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I thought
and
also I heard in there that you can still be aware of another's feelings and choose to
Yeah.
manipulate and gaslight and apply all your
yeah.
tactics. So that tells me I just don't believe people are born bad seeds with no capacity for
Well,
empathy. I think
and
it's always a choice to forego that empathy, and
well,
that might be an ethical or a moral issue.
Well, and that's what I say. That's kind of where I'd say it's kind of asking that question: can it be treated? Can a
Mm-hmm.
personality disorder be treated? Which is where this would fall under clinical terms, and the answer is yes. Is it difficult to treat? Absolutely, but can they learn empathy? Can they choose? Can they fall back into the old patterns? Absolutely, or
Mm-hmm.
can they choose to continually work to learn how to empathize and to
How do you teach humanity?
it's difficult. That's why it's very difficult. They're probably one of the most difficult personalities disorders to work with for that reason.
Oh,
It's
wow.
difficult.
Wow. Well, and in my mind, of course, serial killers have come up, right? Oh, he was always a loner. He did bury that puppy and then mow over it with a lawnmower. Yeah, thinking back, but also cult leaders come to mind.
Mm.
Are cult leaders narcissists with the sadistic slant, or is it just the addiction to power and manipulating other people?
Both, I think, is the answer. It can be either. Some are truly sadistic, but basically a cult is um, is a narcissistic society. You
Hmm.
have a boss, you have someone who calls the shots, and the rest, like sheep, follow.
Hmm.
There is
And you
no.
get to have sex with all of them too. That's the best part.
Well, yeah, that's another thing for narcissists. There are three things they love: status, sex, and stuff. So
Oh, like material possessions.
Mhm.
one of the one of the things of narcissism is sexual prowess.
Hmm.
It's something they pride themselves in, but it's again, it's a myth.
It's self-perpetuating, because I think if you find yourself able to procure, let's say you're good looking and you find yourself able to procure, by indulging that and getting your validation from that, the more you do it, the more you're cementing it.
It does. The problem is that with all these things, we're not talking about an infinite relationship. The narcissistic abuse cycle starts off with everything's rosy, everything is perfect, you're the best partner for me. When they've got the person hooked in and usually feeling obligated in some way because the narcissist has been so generous, then the narcissist flips it on its head and and starts to dislike the person and devalue the person for exactly the things that previously they've said they love about them,
Hmm.
and they will then go back to giving a little bit more love and then taking it away again. This is that intermittent reinforcement where they give you a high, then give you a low, which in itself is addictive.
I
It
was gonna say
really is the dopamine cycle.
it sounds like a little bit the I keep wanting to say empath, but the victim of the narcissist gets their own validation by keeping their gaze or getting positive encouragement.
Not really. It's a in a proper relationship, the validation from the other person is genuine. So if you go into a relationship with somebody, the relationship depends on two people and it
Hmm.
depends on input and take from both. With a narcissistic relationship, there is no give from the narcissist. They just project this image to the victim very cleverly, because this whole love bombing thing, what they will do, for example, is they'll get to know you. They'll ask loads and loads and loads of questions, so they quickly profile you. What makes you tick?
Hmm. Hmm.
What's your trigger? What is it that they can pull away to do, to dismantle you? What can they give to make you feel valued?
Hmm.
They store all this away and then they basically mirror it back. So
Hmm.
someone doesn't go into a relationship thinking, oh, I'll go and look for someone. They might be abusive and they might actually be totally insincere. When you meet somebody and they give back what you do, you initially interpret that as love. The problem with the narcissist is that that's so perfect that the victim gets bound in very quickly. But also what the narcissist does is they up the pace of everything. So the time from meeting to marriage can be as short as 2 or 3 months.
Is that because they don't want to be found out, or what? Why?
It's all, well, it's about getting people under their power. You know, the narcissist is solely after validation from that other person. Once they've got them, if you like, legally attached or emotionally attached, then they're there at the narcissist's bidding.
It's a victory.
And so that person will thought, you know, the narcissist has this way of making the person give and give and give, and then they devalue them in such a way that the victim then thinks, gosh, what have I done wrong? And
well, that's why I mentioned that there must be some dopamine going on when they do get the validation from the narcissist, when they get the attention of the narcissist. You know, they rely on that. They, you know, it's like I didn't want to be crude, but I think we've all experienced degrees of this. I mean, I went on one date. I've never been stuck in a narcissistic relationship, but I've certainly seen it in action, you know, on a scale, like we've said. But it's like a pimp knows to slap the prostitute and then kiss her within 30 seconds. Like, you want to keep them addicted to the love, but you know what I mean? Let them know there are rules.
Yeah, that narcissism is pimping.
Right, absolutely. Well, that's what I was hearing.
It is the perfect picture, you know, punish, reward, keep them tied in, keep them locked in, because once you've got a dedicated source of supply or a dedicated source of validation, it means you have to, you know, not work so hard to go anywhere else. The trouble is that the narcissists, because they do everything fast, they also get over relationships quickly, and they can easily get bored very quickly. You know, it starts off as rosy, but very soon the narcissist is feeling disenchanted with it all. So multiple parallel relationships is quite common in, you know, even within a narcissistic marriage. The narcissist will very often have at least one, if not more, partners on the go at the same time, because that's what they're entitled to. You know, you have to remember they're driven by this sense of entitlement where everybody's there to serve them, and therefore it doesn't matter what they want, they'll get it.
You know, Virginia mentioned rehabilitation in so many words. You know, are they redeemable? Is there rehabilitation? Do you mind telling our listeners about how you worked with your friend, not in a clinical context, from what I understand? It seemed like you were just there for her as a friend. But what did the answer turn out to be in that case?
Most of my work, you know, when you put the mistakes to one side and the lessons I learned from those mistakes, my most effective work and most of my work ended up being listening, so that I could then reflect back what was happening, so that I could allow my friend to actually appreciate themselves what was happening. Because when we started, it was so alien to them. They just kept using terms like, I'm going mad, I'm a horrible person, I'm full of vengeance, I feel hateful, I don't know what's going on. And this was the kind of level of confusion she'd got. And so a lot of what I did was simply reflecting back to her what was happening and actually validating her thoughts, because narcissists will invalidate the victim's thoughts continually as a means of keeping them under control, because it makes the victim think they're mad and therefore have no agency on their own, and therefore they look to the narcissist for direction and for help and for advice. But actually part of supporting people is to enable them to find their own voice and their own ability to realize that they can think, and also realize that they can come up with, you know, their own solutions. They don't have to depend on other people, but that's a very, very slow process. And so at the beginning, the input is very much, in my case, was there was a divorce to go through, so it was the practical, physical things that could help, filling in the forms, helping them in
Mm-hmm.
the solicitor, etc. Listening to what the solicitor was saying, and then relaying it back afterwards, for example, because one of the things when you're under stress is that your ability to understand is non-existent. You're in fright and flight mode most of the time,
Mm-hmm.
and it also actually erodes your memory. So you've got rubbish memory, you've got no
Mm-hmm.
ability to think,
Yeah,
and therefore you're
problem solving is kind of non-existent when you're in crisis
exactly.
mode, right?
Yeah. So a lot of my role was the problem solving in simple. This is what this is what we need to do here, when it was a practical thing. But what I learnt very quickly was that when it came to things which involved her making a decision for herself and had a sort of an emotional dimension to it, it was actually really important that she made those decisions, because there were times, for example, when I could see the way she needed to go, and I sort of did the classic male thing, which is
Uh-oh.
I'm going to fix this.
Right, right.
That is the ultimate disaster in this
Mm.
situation, because what then happened is she interpreted my actions as being narcissistic. So what I
Right,
was
right,
doing by
right.
saying, this is what you need to do,
Mm-hmm.
all I was doing was simply imitating what her husband had been saying to her for 15 years.
Wow, yeah.
And she then actually
At least
reacted
she
against
recognized
that.
it. It's good. That's a step that she recognizes that, you know. But I think,
Yeah,
and whenever we're trying to serve or be of service, I think just being there, like you said, and handling the logistics, that probably goes further than giving advice, right?
yeah. And it's the being, it's an old adage. I'm sure you've come across it many times, but we've got two ears and one mouth. Use them in that proportion. Although if you're dealing with a victim of narcissism, put some duct tape over your mouth to
Right.
prevent you on the
Well, but
reflex
it sounds like
responses.
you fed back to her a little bit, just to make her aware of her responsibility in it. Feedback is, I think, got to be helpful.
Yeah, and the biggest lesson I learned is there's no exact science to it, and it's
Mm.
about as a victim, as a supporter of a
Mhm,
victim,
mhm,
you have to be as far away from narcissistic response as you can be, so that when they ask you questions, when they accuse you of things, when they're bewildered or frustrated, that you don't immediately internalize that, take it on as personal responsibility, and lash out,
mhm,
because a lot of what they're doing is, as you've said, processing stuff which is difficult, and it's costly for them, because they're having to re-feel emotions that they felt before. They're having to remember things for the sake of the divorce and
mhm,
things that have done, and then things will begin to fall into place. And then when they realize that it falls into place, um, it becomes a really painful thing for them. In fact, the lady who I helped, when she was younger, she lost two children. One before he was born, but she lost him through a road accident.
mhm.
And the other one, she was her daughter was 18 months old, playing in a child's play area, and a van reversed over the top of her without realizing
Holy
she was
crap!
there. Now this
Jeez.
this was back in the late 60s. So
Do you think though
it took.
that somehow set the stage emotionally for her to fall victim to a narcissistic relationship? What sets one up? Do you know what I mean? To be the perfect victim.
Victims of narcissists are genuine. 95% of the time, statistically, I might not be accurate there, but the majority of the time, victims of narcissists are normal, nice people that want to give their best to
Mhm,
and find a partner who they can love and who can love them. What they don't realize at the time, and the reason they fall foul of it, is this whole mask thing that the narcissist projects to them. and
But how,
they
I guess my
fall.
question is, how can we protect ourselves from finding ourselves in a narcissistic relationship? If it can happen to
Um,
anyone, maybe we could
yeah,
talk about how do you protect yourself from it?
narcissists have it depends on situation. So, for example, if you meet someone through a social setting or a work setting, people who are narcissistic by their characteristics impact others. So there are signs that you can see within groups of
Mm,
people. And also, if you are aware of people that they interact with,
mm,
you can always just say to these people, out of earshot or whatever,
mhm,
how have you found this person? Because Simon Sinek, who's a big one on, I don't, have you come across him? He's brilliant on relationships and on the whole thing of finding your reason and stuff. But he says if you want to find a narcissist, the easiest thing is ask a team for the biggest asshole in the room, and they'll point to him
right.
straight away.
So looking for the
So
red flags,
yes,
part of it's awareness. Culturally, we can become aware, and then looking for the red flags.
yes, and if you are in a position to be able to do that with from a community of people, you're in a very privileged position because a lot of these things, particularly with the online dating,
Mm,
just as with the social media, that's a narcissist's gold mine because they can project the false image, they can put up the
right.
perfect photos, they can give the right background, they can find out from the prospective partner's biog
Hmm.
what they like and what they don't like, play to it
Wow.
and hook the victim. So that's another. I can't say that it's been proven research wise because I don't know, but I think that's one of the other dangers of the technology age,
Right.
of not doing the groundwork relationships wise, not understanding the markers and the signals,
Hmm.
and the red flags and the danger signs.
Yeah. Netflix has a couple really great mini documentaries about whether it's the sperm donor that has 500 children. I don't know if you've seen that one, or
Hmm.
just, yeah, serial online daters that absolutely catfish and then victimize.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think Netflix has a corner on that market. But yeah, it is tricky. It sounds like, though, because the terminology is so muddled and the waters are so muddied in a way. And I have this opinion that we can all have our checklist of what we're looking for in a partner. And when we begin dating, we can stalk them to the degree we want. We can check in with their friends and try, but that's actually counterproductive. I mean, manifestation circles will say, if you want a partner, why do you have a single bed? Get a double bed. If you want Santa Claus to come, you put the
yeah,
stocking out. So
yeah,
when you have that checklist, I just have the opinion that I'm grateful for anything that comes along. I'm grateful for anyone, and it's probably a problem, but anyone that gives me a second glance, I'm grateful for it. And so the checklist is a way of, for some people, protecting themselves from the opportunities right in front of them. So how would you say you strike that balance? If let's assume society is becoming, even with all the muddied waters and the misuse of the terms, becoming a little more educated on this front, and we know what to look out for now. How do you parse between shortening that list of qualifications, lest you miss out on life's opportunities, and being vigilant?
it's a difficult one, isn't it?
I
Because
that's why I asked. I'm
you're
like,
dealing,
I wouldn't. I
yeah,
thank God I'm not out there online dating.
you're dealing with emotions. Um, I think with probably the best, if you like, general rule is
Mhm,
that if you are in a relationship and for any reason you are feeling uncomfortable,
mhm,
then at least take a step back and analyze.
mhm.
As I say, one of the things narcissists do give themselves away by doing everything fast, over the top. It's all exaggerated. It's all the gifts are extravagant. The holidays are extravagant. The
Mm,
praise is extravagant. If you're getting stuff which is making you feel uncomfortable in your
mhm.
gut,
Yeah,
then take a step back. and just think about it,
That's a
because
good policy in life. Trust your gut. Yeah.
yeah, and it's one, it is one of the things when you get onto the people who are involved in counselling. One of the things they mention a lot to victims is, what does it feel like, or what did it feel like?
Mm-hmm.
Because that, if you're sensing that it's too good to be true, or that your gut's uncomfortable, then there's a pretty good reason for that happening. There's something subconsciously that you've picked up
Mm-hmm.
that has bypassed your thinking center, but it's signaling all the alarms to your brain,
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
take a step back. So I think narcissists like deep commitment quickly.
Mm-hmm.
If you take a relationship, no matter where you come from, if you are taking a relationship slowly and methodically, if you find the other person trying to rush you and hurry you up and get you into deep commitments and doing things for you that to try and make you feel obligated to them, take a step back or just walk away, because
Mm-hmm.
those are serious red flags that if you wait too long, because of the way they operate, you can get hooked in, and you can feel obliged to be with them
Mm-hmm.
and do what they say, in a very, very short period of time.
Wow. Virginia, do you have anything to say on the clinical front? It's gone over an hour and a half, and I do think
Yeah.
we've just
I
scratched the surface. I think we
yeah,
need to do part two.
yeah, I was just gonna add one thing to what Stuart just said, on the counseling side. And I'm not the one who coined this. I've actually heard this from a few people, but the one I hear say it a lot is John Deloney. Um, he's a PhD, and he always says behavior is a language. He's not the only one who says it, but he says it a lot on his podcast, and that's true. And so it's in counseling they talk about that nonverbal is the high communication, and verbal is the low communication. So in counseling, we focus highly on nonverbal cues, because
Mm,
you actually are told more there than in what's actually being contextually said.
mm. Yeah, so learning these, not just the red flags, but right, learning the nuances of nonverbal communication. And I don't want to make it about me, and we are coming to a close, but I just, and I don't have any answers clearly, but I'm sitting here going, either everybody I've ever dated is a narcissist. I really am thinking, oh my God, I've dated a number of narcissists. It's not just that one bad date that I mentioned. I'm thinking, maybe low level narcissism. But I will say, absolutely, I was blindsided. I would never invest in a relationship if it didn't feel mutual. It feels 100% mutual. So, because, they all ended, I was sitting here going, wow, I'm going to really put some thought into whether they were clinical narcissists or if it's just that's life. That's just my take on it. Like some of it's like, sounds like life to me. But
Yeah,
clinical,
and
it's very
there is
real. The clinical diagnosis is very real. And I am now I'll get back to you. Maybe next episode I'll get back to you on whether everybody I've ever dated is a narcissist or not.
yeah, I just think for your peace of mind, one thing that has been noticed is that if you have been susceptible to a narcissist in one relationship,
Hmm.
then there is a chance that you will be targeted by others,
Of
and
course.
you
Yeah, it's
may
like
well.
molestation sets you up for more, right? You
Yeah,
become a magnet
but it's
for.
just I guess it, if nothing else, just a takeaway message is, am I good fodder for a narcissist? If so, why? And if I am, what can I do to protect myself against those sorts of people? One of the things that my friend experienced more than once was her ex, because she was forced to live in the same house as her husband whilst the divorce was going on, because he had all the finances in his name and wouldn't give her anything.
Hmm.
She had to live under the same roof. And what he would do is he would know what buttons to press until she
Right.
snapped. And then when she snapped, he was
Right.
straight to the police, and the police were
Mm.
around investigating her for, abuse, for assault, and whatever. Fortunately, he did it too often. And
Right.
also, we pointed out to the police what was happening in reality. He would continually ask questions that caused her doubt her, her memory, or twist the facts that she would be thinking, I'm sure it wasn't like that. And eventually he would just keep doing that until she realized what was happening, or until she realized that, yes, she was right and he was just talking a load of rubbish.
Some terms have come up like blaming the victim and gaslighting. And I do think some of this is human nature. There's a sociological principle that says if you've wronged somebody or betrayed them, you still have to sleep at night and therefore frame yourself as a decent person. So that is
Yeah.
what blaming the victim arises out of is, oh, well, they deserved it. And you kind of create that narrative that, you're beyond contempt and that they deserved it. And so the next time you betray them, you're going to dig your heels even more and blame. So some of it is human nature. It just seems like when it's in the extreme. What I will say, I came into this saying the judgmental part of me, when I hear this friend that I mentioned cry narcissist over and over again, I very much, the judgmental part of me, the less compassionate part of me has said, look for your responsibility in this. It takes two to tango. Now I'm just trying to be vulnerable and saying, I actually see how it could happen because I had so many boundaries. Right. You know me, Virginia. I'm nothing but good judgment. I identify, anyway, talk about narratives and the stories we tell ourselves. I've traditionally identified as a good judge of character. I do trust my gut. But more than that, principle has been my downfall. Having those boundaries, separating emotional experiences from policy, that's my entire adult life. And yet I fell victim to it. And I'm sitting there looking back going, they were so charming, and so I think it can happen to anybody. And that maybe that's good for me in opening up my compassion and suspending my judgment.
Yeah, we all have blind areas. That's just part of human nature too.
Yeah, I guess
Yeah,
if it
I mean,
repeats, you pay attention if it's a repeated pattern, I would think.
one thing that my friend said partway through her experience to her solicitor, she said, if I wrote down my story as it happens and submit it to Hollywood, it would be rejected for
Right.
being too far-fetched.
Well, life is stranger than fiction. I think all of us, when we put pen to paper, right, in the spirit of our podcasts.
Yeah, I think that when you're talking about narcissists, you're talking about a quantum leap different. You're not talking about the odd anomaly or the odd occasion. A narcissistic relationship is so dysfunctional that those outside can't see it, and those inside will commit suicide to get out of it. That's the disparity between the two faces of it. The public face, which is the altruistic charmer, and the reality, which is the abuser and cold.
Yeah, well, gregarious comes to mind. This guy, you know what I mean? He held court, just gregarious, and it is hard to reconcile. Yeah,
charming and charisma are two things that they always say. If you find someone who's charming and high charisma, and also can hold dominate a room, then you've got three pretty good ingredients for a narcissist.
Well, yeah, and thankfully, I think I not only recognize the red flags now, but I actually have a knee-jerk reaction to, I mean, if it's just a waitress, it's like, why do you need the waitress to like you? You can see it a mile away when somebody absolutely needs everyone in the room to like them, and it's a competition. Life's not a competition. So now I'm thinking of all my friends that are narcissists. Anyway, I do think we need to bring it to a close because it's been an hour and a half. So Virginia, do you have any final questions?
No, I think we've really have covered the gambit, to be honest.
Oh, I think we've covered a lot, but I think we've scratched the tip of an iceberg. I want to have you back on. I feel like it's the tip of an iceberg. But Stuart, then I would say to you, do you feel robbed? Is there anything you really had hoped to impart? We're going to put the link, obviously, to your book. We'll put that in the episode description. But if things didn't go the direction you expected, is there anything you would really love to impart in our closing minutes?
I think that one of the take-home strengths of this interview is that it illustrates how multifaceted narcissism is, how it impacts us all in so many different areas and in so many different ways, that actually trying to get your head even around the basics is, it's kind of it can be an uncharted territory, really. It can be like, drop me off in the middle of the Sierra Nevada and say, okay, get yourself out. I'd be dead within a couple of days. But that it really illustrates why I tried to write the book in the way that I did, because it takes, I've just tried to take people through the story with me from beginning to end, and put into that not just my personal experience, but I've done the research behind it, which is, this is what I noticed, and this is what the experts, and this is what current best opinion, and best information has to say about how to deal with that. So it's definitely not a self-help book as such, but it's written for anybody who would want to just delve deeper into narcissism. And I've tried to make it structured, and it's, any jargon is explained as it goes along, so it's not one of those books. I'm a big believer in not using jargon, because I think jargon separates and divides rather than unites. And whilst it's helpful for those in the know, people need to understand the implications, not just the words. So the words are in there, they're defined, and the implications are in there as well, along with what I hope are a lot of, just practical ways to deal with a narcissist in everyday life, at work, in the family, in the community, that kind of thing. And if you want to get away from them, ways that you can do that, and ways to sort of start rebuilding your life.
Beautiful. Yeah, it sounds great. I will be reading it, especially after this conversation. I think I should read it. Yeah, I love it. And it sounds a little bit, because we've been talking about pop psychology. So that's a form of jargon, but then so is clinical terminology. So it does sound like it's for everybody.
Exactly.
And we all do need to learn how to deal with narcissists in life, like you said, whether it's on the job or in not even a romantic relationship, a friendship. Yeah, I think it sounds like it's valuable to everybody.
It's really about raising awareness. If you don't know the problems there, you can't deal with it, and that's what narcissist. I think one of my quotes from the book is that our ignorance is a narcissist's kingdom, and
Wow, yeah,
it's that kind of thing where the less people know about them, the longer they can stay hidden.
right.
So this is really, it's not written as a solve it all book. What it is saying, look, these people exist, they're around us every day, this is what they look like, this is what they can do. And if nothing else, it makes you more aware, so that you can protect yourself, from these sorts of encounters that can be life changing and life ending.
Yep. My takeaway is trust your gut. And, on this podcast, we've talked about cycles, and it's like, how many times can you tell yourself, trust your gut? Those that betray you will gaslight you. And it always comes back to just trusting your gut. So that's my takeaway. But also maybe, I'm putting myself out there as the guinea pig, but I think you both probably heard me say, it's like, but why would I turn my back on what seems like a gift that's dropped in your path? So you do have to have standards. I tend to think of a long list of qualifications for a partner is limiting. But, I think we all know for ourselves where we're actually sparing ourselves needless drama, right? And maybe trusting the gut as well. That's my takeaway personally.
I think it's just it's taking knowledge and making it wisdom.
Through experience, like applying the knowledge
Yeah.
with life experience. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I know there's more, and I will be reading the book, but hopefully you'll be willing to come on for a second time, and we'll go out down a different tangent next time.
Yes, indeed. And hopefully when they put the 2 5-hour podcasts together, they'll have a comprehensive length, breadth, and depth of narcissism and how to handle it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for sharing. And to our listeners, remember, life is story, and we can get our hands in the clay. Individually and collectively, we can tell a new story. See you next time.
We want to take a moment to thank our wonderful listeners and supporters. Your continued support and sharing of our podcast helps us spread the transformative power of storytelling. If you enjoy our episodes, please rate and review us on your favorite platform and share the podcast with friends and family. For more enriching conversations and insights, subscribe to Language of the Soul podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media and visit our Patreon website for the latest updates and exclusive content. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to life. If you'd like to support us further, consider joining our Patreon community for exclusive content and donation options. Every bit of support helps us reach more hearts and minds.